So I want you to imagine it's the year 1500. A Spanish royal investigator arrives at this settlement in the Caribbean, steps off his ship, and literally the very first thing he sees are 4 European mutineers swinging from the gallows.
Right, which is just an incredible image.
Yeah, and the man responsible for all this chaos, the governor of the island, Cristoforo Columbus.
The one and only.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're unpacking a massive stack of sources for you. We've got historical logs, encyclopedias, and these really sharp modern cultural critiques. We're looking at the biography, history, adventures, and the deeply, deeply contested legacy of Columbus.
And honestly, what becomes immediately apparent when you read through these materials is the absolute whiplash between them.
Right, totally.
Like, in one text, he is this visionary pioneer who bravely connected the globe, right? And in the very next source, he's described as a cruel tyrant responsible for just immense suffering.
It's night and day. And just so we're clear up front, our goal today is not to pick a side or endorse a specific viewpoint. We are just here to impartially guide you through the facts and historical debates exactly as they show up in the source material. We want to see how one guy managed to generate such fiercely contradictory legacies and, how he accidentally sparked a massive global chain reaction.
Yeah, accidentally being the operative word there.
Right. So let's wind the clock back to before the gallows, before the governorship, and before all the myth-making. Who actually was this guy?
Well, he was a wool weaver's son. He was from the Republic of Genoa, born around 1451.
Okay, so Italian.
Right, Italian. And his father, Domenico, also ran a cheese stall. So we are talking about distinctly middle-class beginnings here.
Definitely not nobility.
No, not at all. He was described as a robust, tall man with a florid complexion, and he went to sea really young. His early life was just incredibly volatile.
Volatile how? Like bad weather?
More like pirates.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's a defining moment in the sources from 1476. He was on a Genoese merchant ship, and it gets attacked by French privateers off the coast of Portugal.
Privateers being basically state-sanctioned pirates, right?
Exactly. So the ship is destroyed, it sinks, and Columbus is just thrown into the ocean.
I mean, I always kind of pictured explorers of this era as like aristocratic Naval Academy graduates in crisp uniforms.
Oh no! He literally survives this attack by grabbing a giant floating oar from the wreckage.
You're kidding me.
No, he uses it to support himself and paddles all the way to the Portuguese shore.
That is wild. Just clinging to an oar.
That sheer survival instinct really defines his entire life. So after that, he ends up settling in Lisbon. He starts working as a cartographer, a map maker with his brother Bartolomeo.
Okay, but the geopolitical landscape of the mid-15th century was shifting pretty dramatically underneath them at this point, wasn't it?
Immensely. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople.
Which basically slammed the door shut on Europe's overland trade routes to Asia. I mean, suddenly the flow of spices, silk, gold, all that wealth is just cut off.
Right, and it triggered a severe economic crisis across Europe. They desperately needed a new sea route to the Indies.
And everyone else was trying to solve this by going south.
Right.
Like navigating all the way around the treacherous southern tip of Africa.
Yeah, the Portuguese were pushing hard on that route, but Columbus proposes a completely different solution. He says, let's just sail west across the open Atlantic.
Okay, here's where I get stuck. Because the standard story we all hear growing up is that Columbus was this lone genius who realized the Earth was round while everyone else thought he would sail off the edge into space or whatever.
Yeah, and the sources are very clear that that is a complete fabrication. It was invented centuries later.
Wait, really?
Oh, yeah. Every educated person in the 15th century knew the Earth was a sphere. The scholarly debate was never about the shape of the planet.
Then what were they arguing about?
It was about its exact circumference, how big the sphere actually was.
Ah, so this is where his notorious math problem comes in.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, because he calculated the distance from Europe to Japan at barely 5,000 miles, which, if I'm reading this right, is roughly a quarter of the actual distance. How does a professional mapmaker make a mistake that massive?
Well, the sources suggest he intentionally cherry-picked his data to fit his ambitions. He relied heavily on the writings of a 9th century Persian astronomer named Alfraganus.
Okay.
But Columbus made a fatal conversion error. He confused Arabic miles, which were significantly longer, with the shorter Roman miles.
Oh, no.
Yeah. That fundamental misunderstanding essentially shrank the entire globe by 25% in his mind.
It is exactly like a modern tech founder confidently pitching a startup to venture capitalists using, like, entirely manipulated data.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, he takes this incredibly optimistic projection to the royal courts of Portugal, Genoa, and Venice. They all consult their own experts, realize his math is completely wrong, and reject him.
Over and over again.
But he simply refuses to accept reality until someone finally buys the flawed pitch.
And the venture capitalists who eventually buy in are King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain.
Right.
But the financial angle, the promise of endless gold and spices, that's only half the story. The religious motivation driving Columbus is arguably just as strong.
Yeah, I saw that in the text. He was deeply religious.
Extremely. Later in life, he even signed his name Ex-Botherens.
Which translates to the Christ bearer.
Exactly. He actually saw himself as literally carrying Christianity across the ocean. His stated ultimate ambition was to use the untold riches he expected to find in Asia to fund a massive Christian crusade.
A crusade.
Yeah, to recapture Jerusalem from Islamic control.
Wow, so it's essentially a holy war funded by bad math.
That is one way to summarize it, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So in August 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella finally give him his fleet, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria.
And the voyage itself sounds just agonizing. I mean, weeks of empty ocean and a crew that's on the brink of throwing him overboard.
The psychological tension was immense. As they sailed further west, the ship's compass needles began drifting off true north due to magnetic variation.
Oh, that must have been terrifying.
It absolutely terrified the crew. By October 10th, mutiny was a very real, imminent threat.
But then, just 2 days later, on October 12th, a lookout named Rodrigo de Triana spots land.
Right, an island in the Bahamas.
Which the local Taino people called Guanahani.
Yeah.
Columbus steps off the boat, names it San Salvador, and assumes he has hit the outer archipelago of Japan.
And this arrival really forces us to address the word discovery.
Yes, I definitely have to push back on that term. Because I'm looking at the historical timelines in our sources here, and Leif Erikson and the Vikings landed in North America 500 years before Columbus.
Mm-hmm.
Add that to the millions of indigenous people already living there with complex societies, and discovery just feels fundamentally inaccurate.
It's a vital distinction, and the sources acknowledge this. Columbus was not the first human, nor was he even the first European in the Americas.
Right.
But 1492 is universally recognized as the pivot point because it initiated permanent contact.
Permanence.
Yeah, the Viking outposts were temporary. They didn't integrate the hemispheres. Columbus's arrival was the catalyst that permanently unlocked widespread European exploration and just fundamentally rewired the globe's ecology and economy.
I imagine that permanence did not come smoothly, especially since his flagship, the Santa Maria, runs aground on a sandbank and literally sinks on Christmas Day. 1492.
Yeah, leaving him with a massive logistical crisis. He is forced to use the salvaged wood from the sinking ship to build a crude fort, which he names La Navidad.
And he leaves 39 of his men behind there.
He has to. There's no room on the other ships.
So he sails back to Spain on the remaining ships, declares this massive victory based on a few gold trinkets and some captive Taino people, and gets funding for a much larger second voyage.
A massive colonization effort.
I'm assuming that second trip is his triumphant return to La Navidad.
Yeah, you would think so, but it is a really grim homecoming. When he returns in 1493, this time with a massive fleet of 17 ships and 1,200 men, the fort is in ashes.
Oh, man.
And all 39 men he left behind are dead.
Wiped out by the local population? Or was it infighting?
The sources suggest it was likely a mix of both, largely driven by the Spaniards' immediate abuse of the indigenous people. And from this moment on, the narrative really shifts away from exploration.
What does it become?
It becomes a desperate, escalating scramble to extract wealth.
Because he suddenly has 1,200 men expecting glittering cities of gold, and instead, they're just standing in a jungle.
Exactly.
When we look at his subsequent voyages, they seem to just get progressively more disastrous.
Yeah, the pressure to deliver a return on Spain's massive investment slowly breaks him. By his third voyage in 1498, he does reach the South American mainland in present-day Venezuela.
Okay, that's a milestone.
It is, but his administrative control over the colonies is completely crumbling, and then his fourth and final voyage in 1502 is an absolute catastrophe.
This is the one where he loses his entire fleet, right?
Every single ship. He is exploring Central America, gets caught in severe storms, and his wooden hulls are completely completely devoured by shipworms.
Well, the ship wars.
Yeah, these marine mollusks that literally bore right into the timber. So he and his men end up stranded on the island of Jamaica for a year.
A whole year marooned.
He only survives because a Spanish crew member and some indigenous allies paddle a modified canoe across the open ocean to Hispaniola to organize a rescue.
Shipwrecked by worms and saved by a canoe. It's almost comical until you look at what he was actually doing while serving as the governor of the Indies on Hispaniola. The historical record gets incredibly dark here.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because the abundant spices and gold he promised the Spanish crown simply weren't there, Columbus had to find another way to generate profit.
Right.
To do this, he instituted the encomienda system.
Break that down for me, because it sounds like this dry bureaucratic term, but the reality was horrific. How did it actually function?
Yeah. Under the encomienda system, the Spanish crown legally granted a colonist a specified number of indigenous people.
Just granted them people.
Yes. The colonist was theoretically supposed to protect them and convert them to Christianity. But in practice, it was just a brutal framework for forced labor. Columbus used this to enslave the Taino people.
The sources mention strict quotas.
Exactly. He imposed these quotas, forcing them to mine for whatever little gold existed or demanding punishing labor in the fields. And if they failed to meet their quotas, the punishments were barbaric.
He also just outright loaded ships with enslaved Taino people to sell in European markets.
Yes, he did.
The demographic collapse detailed in these sources is hard to wrap your head around. It's staggering.
By 1496, which is just 4 years after his initial arrival, the Taino population on Hispaniola dropped by roughly 2/3.
4 years to wipe out 2/3 of the population.
It was a devastating combination. You had extreme violence, the harsh conditions of the encomienda labor, and the introduction of European diseases.
Which they had no immunity to.
Right. Over the next 4 decades, an estimated 7 million Taino died across the region. By 1535, their distinct culture on Hispaniola was effectively gone.
This brings us back to that incredible image from the start of the deep dive. The Spanish crown hears these constant reports of chaos, rebellion, and tyranny under Columbus's administration, so they send Francisco de Bobadilla to investigate.
And Bobadilla arrives, sees the Spanish mutineers hanging from the gallows, and immediately arrests Columbus and his brothers for malfeasance and brutal mismanagement.
Just strips him of his power.
Completely. The admiral of the ocean sea is stripped of his authority and shipped back to Europe in chains.
Which he then turns into a bizarre point of pride, right? Stubbornly refusing to take the chains off and even asking to be buried in them.
Yeah, he was very dramatic about it.
When you look at the primary accounts of his governance, it seems pretty cut and dry that it was a horrific failure. Yet this remains fiercely debated.
It does, and this is where we have to look at how historians approach the era. Some scholars argue Columbus must be viewed strictly as a product of 15th century Europe.
Okay, meaning what exactly?
Meaning the harsh physical punishments, cutting off noses or ears for minor infractions, and the whole concept of violent conquest. Those were the grim status quo of the period. They argue he was simply executing the standard operating procedure of a European empire.
But other historians argue he went way beyond the baseline of his own era.
Precisely. They point to contemporary critics, like the Spanish priest, Bartolomé de las Casas. He actually lived through the events and wrote extensive, damning accounts of the brutality.
So people at the time knew it was bad.
Yes. If people in Columbus's own time recognized his actions as excessively cruel and tyrannical, many modern scholars argue it's entirely fair to condemn him as the architect of a localized genocide.
As our sources show, both of these views exist and are heavily debated. And whether you view him as a pioneer, adhering to the norms of his day, or a cruel tyrant, the localized violence of his governance was really only the beginning.
That's true.
His voyages unlocked a biological event that permanently altered the trajectory of life on Earth.
We are talking about the Columbian Exchange.
Right.
The term was actually coined by historian Alfred W. Crosby in 1972, and it refers to the massive transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and human populations between Afro-Eurasia and the Americas.
The analogy that helps me visualize this best is, it's not like a cultural potluck. It is like taking two massive sealed terrariums, that had been evolving in total isolation for millions of years and suddenly just smashing them together.
I love that analogy.
The ecosystems just bleed into each other with chaotic results. Let's look at the flora first.
Okay, so from the Americas to the rest of the world came corn, tomatoes, cassava, sweet potatoes, and most importantly, the potato.
I know potatoes became a global staple, but how exactly did a root vegetable alter global history?
It comes down to caloric density. An acre of potatoes yields vastly more calories than an acre of wheat or oats, and they can grow in terrible, rocky, cold soil.
So you can feed a lot more people.
Exactly. Suddenly, European and Asian populations had a cheap, highly reliable food source that could stave off famine.
So it frees up labor. I mean, if you don't need 80% of your population farming just to survive, those people can do other things.
It physically enabled the urbanization that led to the Industrial Revolution. Potatoes accounted for an estimated 12 to 25% of the massive population boom in Afro-Eurasia between 1700 and 1900.
That is incredible. And going the other direction, from the Old World to the Americas, Europe brought wheat, rice, sugarcane, and coffee.
Right.
But the most dramatic introduction was the livestock, right? Pigs, cattle, sheep, and horses. I always associate the Plains Indians in North America with horses, but you're telling me there was not a single horse there before 1492.
Not a single one.
Wow.
The introduction of the horse completely revolutionized indigenous cultures. It transformed mobility, hunting, and warfare across the continents.
But this terrarium smash a much darker, microscopic side.
Yes, the deadliest export from the Old World was disease. We're talking about virgin soil epidemics.
Because they had no immunity.
Exactly. Because the populations of the Americas had zero prior exposure or genetic resistance to pathogens like smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus, the mortality rates were apocalyptic.
The estimates here in the text are horrifying. Something like 80 to 95% of the indigenous population died in the epidemics following contact.
And the exchange wasn't entirely a one-way street, microbiologically speaking. Columbus's crew likely brought a highly virulent strain of syphilis back to Europe.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it subsequently swept across the continent, killing up to 5 million people.
That demographic collapse in the Americas directly triggers the most devastating domino effect of the entire era.
The labor shortage.
Right.
See, European colonizers had set up these massive plantations to grow their new cash crops, particularly sugar and rice. And those are incredibly labor-intensive.
Very hard work.
With the indigenous populations dying off at unprecedented rates, the colonizers faced an economic crisis. They needed a new, massive workforce.
So they turned to the Atlantic slave trade. Over 11.7 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas to work these plantations.
It's a direct chain reaction.
Yeah, the biological collapse of one hemisphere fundamentally caused the mass enslavement and forced migration of another.
It completely re-engineered the demographic, cultural, and economic future of the planet. And the sheer scale of this transformation began unfolding within just a few decades of that first voyage.
Which is wild because Columbus himself lived to see almost none of it.
No, he didn't.
Let's get back to the man himself. He dies in 1506 in Valladolid, Spain. He's only about 54 years old, suffering from gout, severe arthritis, and failing eyesight.
Right, his health was terrible. But he was actually quite wealthy from his New World holdings, despite the disgrace of his governorship.
So he wasn't happy, right?
No, he felt utterly betrayed by the crown. He spent his final years, and his heirs spent decades after his death, locked in lawsuits against the Spanish monarchy.
Suing for what?
Demanding a 10% cut of all New World profits.
Unbelievable. And he goes to his grave firmly believing he had reached the eastern edge of Asia. He never even grasped that he had stumbled onto an entirely separate landmass.
Never.
So how do we get from a disgraced, litigious explorer who didn't even know what continent he was on to the ultimate American hero? I mean, we have cities, a national capital, and a federal holiday named after him.
It is a fascinating cultural pivot, and it is entirely about nation building.
How so?
Well, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the newly formed United States and various Latin American countries were breaking away from the British and Spanish Empire.
Right, they're independent now.
But they needed an origin story that completely bypassed their former colonizers.
So they look back in the archives, find this Italian sailor who got screwed over by the Spanish crown, and decide he is the perfect blank slate.
Exactly. The turning point is Washington Irving's 1828 biography of Columbus.
The guy who wrote Sleepy Hollow.
Yes. The very same. Irving heavily embellished the story, ignoring the atrocities and turning Columbus into a self-made, visionary genius who conquered the unknown. Columbus basically became the ultimate embodiment of the American dream.
And this myth-making peaks at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, right?
Yeah.
They build this massive white city to celebrate the 400th anniversary of his voyage.
It went all out.
But the sources point out this wasn't just about general American pride. It was a highly specific political move for Italian Americans, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Italian immigrants faced intense anti-Catholic prejudice and discrimination in the United States.
They were really marginalized.
So these organizations championed Columbus's legacy as a way to prove that an Italian Catholic was foundational to the very existence of America.
That's a powerful argument to make at the time.
It worked. That sustained lobbying effort ultimately resulted in Columbus Day becoming a federal holiday in 1937.
But the narrative never stays put, does it? Fast forward to 1992, the 500th anniversary of the voyage.
The quincentenary marked a massive cultural pendulum swing. There was a much broader scholarly awareness of the Black legend,
Which was essentially a centuries-old propaganda campaign by Spain's Protestant rivals to highlight the extreme cruelty of the Spanish Empire, right?
Correct. The printing press allowed Spain's rivals to amplify the writings of Bartolomé de las Casas across Europe to make Spain look uniquely evil.
But it wasn't just made up.
No, while the Black legend was weaponized for political leverage, the underlying facts of the atrocities were very real. Combine that historical reassessment with rising indigenous activism, and the focus shifted dramatically.
The conversation finally moved away from his navigational skill to the catastrophic consequences of his arrival, which is why today, many municipalities celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day instead of or alongside Columbus Day.
Exactly. His legacy evolved from a determined explorer to a disgraced governor to a mythic hero, and now to a modern symbol of colonial oppression.
Well, to wrap up this deep dive for you listening right now, we've tracked how a fatal math error involving Roman miles and a zealous religious quest led to an accidental landfall.
A landfall that changed everything.
Yeah. That single event devastated millions of lives, smashed two biological terrariums together to build our modern diets, and created a deeply contested legacy that we are still fighting over today.
But before we go, there is one final, lingering detail from the historical record that is really worth your time to mull over. It is about his physical remains.
I love this part.
So after Columbus died in 1506 in Spain, his body didn't stay put.
Of course not.
His remains were moved from Valladolid to Seville. Decades later, his son had the bones shipped across the ocean to Santo Domingo in the Caribbean.
Okay.
Centuries later, when the French took control there, the bones were moved to Havana, Cuba.
Wow.
And finally, after the Spanish-American War, they were shipped back across the Atlantic to Spain.
His bones literally retraced the Atlantic Empire he accidentally created.
Shipped back and forth, claimed by multiple nations, just as his historical legacy is claimed and fought over today.
It's almost poetic.
It is. And it leaves us with a provocative question. If a person's legacy, and even their very bones, can be so completely repurposed by future generations to fit their own political and cultural narratives, how much of history is actually about the past, and how much is just a reflection of the people telling the story?
If that doesn't make you look at a globe a little differently, nothing will. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the history you think you know.